Hi everyone, welcome to this week's recorded lecture. So this is the first of two recorded lectures for this week. We're now moving on to the very last of the three sections of the module. So we're getting near the end of the semester. And as I said, I'm going to try and avoid bringing in new material in the last few weeks of the module. So I think I'm trying to work out where we are. I think this will bring us at least to these lectures will bring us more or less to maybe the start of December anyway. If it's a case that it looks as if we're pushing into the second last week of term, I might push forward with some of these recorded lectures and get them up a bit earlier to allow more time for revision and stuff in the final week or the final 2 weeks. Anyway, I'm rambling here. Okay, so this is the section where I'm going to look at nations and states and nationalism, but also have a brief look at geopolitics. So today I'm going to look at territoriality, boundaries, and the state. So there's a lot of key readings here. Again, if you can dip into some of these readings, brilliant. I know it's a busy time of the year. Now, hopefully by the time you listen to this, you've started listening to this recorded lecture, hopefully you've finished the big written assignment. So the main meaty assignment for this module is over, but I know our deadline was relatively early, and I know there's going to be a lot of big deadlines over the next few weeks. So yeah, try to do some reading. If you can't do reading now, then try and catch up with it maybe in the last 2 weeks of the semester when hopefully all the big assignment deadlines are finally out of the way. Because ultimately the readings are going to help you with the exam. If you're pushing for the high marks, what we do want to see in exam answers is evidence that you've engaged with readings. You've read books, you've drawn some relevant ideas from these books that relate to the specific question you're trying to answer. And definitely these next 3 or 4 lectures are going to be very important in terms of what might or what might not come up on the exam paper in the middle of January or in early January, whenever it is. Who knows, guys? Who knows? So we'll start off with a few definitions. Now, today's lecture will be a bit definition-y, but it's a case of kind of establishing the groundwork for what's going to come in the next or in the following 3 lectures. So we start with the 2 definitions. One of territory. Territory implies a division of political power. So that's the main thing. Territory is usually associated with territories controlled by different states or governments. So the land belonging to a rule of a state. So the modern meaning is closely tied up with the legal concept of sovereignty. And sovereignty is a key element of modern states. Without sovereignty, you don't have a state system. So sovereignty implies that there is one final and absolute authority in a political community. If you don't have that, there's chaos. And if you don't have that, you don't have what we have today, the modern state system. Now, not all territories are sovereign states. So there are a number of territories around the world that claim independence, but they're not recognized as independent states by other members of the United Nations. So recognition of sovereignty usually requires all or most of the members of the United Nations to recognize your territory as an independent sovereign state. And ultimately, it requires you to be accepted as a new member of the United Nations. Now, we get certain phases where there's a lot of new states created. We had a lot of new states created in the period in Europe, in the period between 1989 and the mid to late 1990s, when you had the breakup of the Soviet Union. You had the Velvet Divorce that broke Czechoslovakia into what is now Czechia and Slovakia, and then you had the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. So you had a lot of new states created in what was previously the Soviet Union and parts of Eastern Europe in the 1980s, 1990s. The most recent of which was Montenegro 2006. Big shout out to Montenegro there. There was a lot of new states created in what we call the South, the Global South, or the developing world, particularly in Africa during the period of decolonization in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. The most recent new state, and you can correct me on this, it might have changed by the time you listen to this lecture, the most recent new state was South Sudan, which is a relatively new state just in existence. East Timor is another of the most recent new states as well. East Timor, which is formerly part of Indonesia. So recognition of sovereignty, as I said, it requires other members of the United Nations to recognize you as an independent state, and it requires you to be accepted as a member of the United Nations. Now, if you're accepted as a member of the United Nations, if your independence is recognized, your sovereignty is recognized, that gives you particular rights. So it's important for a territory to be accepted as an independent state, because once you do that, you have certain rights under the United Nations Charter, the most significant of which in Article 2 of the United Nations Charter states that no other member state has the right to interfere in the internal affairs of another member state of the United Nations, which effectively says you should not invade or try to take over another member state of the United Nations. Now, by and large, for large parts of the United Nations history, this Article 2 was largely respected, but in recent years, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a decade before that, the invasion of Iraq by the USA, at certain periods, this article has been overlooked, and it's probably a bit wobblier. Kind of the amount of importance or the amount of respect given to this article has probably become a bit wobblier in the last few years than it has been probably at any point in the United Nations history. The United Nations, of course, was established in the wake of World War II. Now, if you're trying to lay a claim to be an independent state, you need to make a number of claims. So Burkhardt talks about three important types of claims. First of all, he says, if you want to claim your territory as an independent state, the first thing you need to show is that your group or your nation has effective control of that territory. And this idea of effective control, we'll come back to this again when we talk about fragile states and de facto states. That's an important element. If you don't have effective control of the territory, you have no chance of being accepted as an independent state. Territorial integrity, the territory needs to make sense. You can't have bits of territory split up between different other states. You have some exceptions to that, some weird state shapes around the world, but by and large, the shape of your territory needs to make sense. And you need to have historical and cultural claims as to why you should be an independent state, to show that there's a history of maybe a history of your group having had control over that territory in the past, cultural claims to show that your group is culturally distinct, culturally different from other groups or nations in that region. Now, boundaries. If we're doing this module in 1925, most of the module will probably be talking about boundaries, particularly boundaries in Eastern Europe and particularly boundaries in the Balkan region. It's still an interesting topic, but not boundaries probably are, for much of the world's history after World War II, boundaries were less likely to change than would have been the case, say, in the lead up to World War I and immediately after World War I. Now, boundaries are seen as an important element of obviously the world's political system, but also the world's economic system. So the idea of boundaries, it does imply there is a degree of stability, a degree of order. And without that degree of stability and order, the argument is the world political system and also the world economic system would struggle to survive. Boundaries are subject to periodic transgression. Now, when I was growing up, I'm obviously a lot older than you, in the 1970s, much of the 1980s, when we grew up, you kind of look at the state boundaries, and you sort of looked on the state boundaries as being almost as fixed on the map as rivers, mountains, and so on, because boundaries didn't really change that much. If you leave aside, say, the decolonization of Africa in the 50s and 60s, by and large, in the wake of World War II, boundaries didn't really change that much, especially during the Cold War. All that changed in 1989, the fall of communist regimes in Eastern Europe, and ultimately the breakup of Yugoslavia, the breakup of the Soviet Union, and all of a sudden, instead of Europe probably having maybe 30-something countries, Europe now has 50-something states or countries. So boundaries are subject to periodic transgression. They impinge on the landscape, so you have certain boundary. If you leave aside the European Union, where you've got an open boundary process, or even leave aside Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, by and large, you do have certain elements associated with boundaries. So customs posts, sometimes boundary walls, and so on. So boundaries can impact directly on the landscape. In some countries, you will very clearly know when you're coming to the boundary of that country, and that country, a boundary between that country and another country. Particularly if you're looking at countries like the boundaries between countries like Poland and Belarus, and so on, where state relations are not particularly warm. Buffer states, I'll talk about buffer states when I look at Kinder's idea, when we look at what happened in relation to Eastern Europe after World War I. But buffer states, this is the idea that sometimes if you have two big states that are very close together, you can sometimes, peace conferences may decide we'll create a buffer state between these two big states or these two big empires in order to keep them apart. And as I said, this was the idea of creating new states in Eastern Europe. This was part of the idea behind creating new states in Eastern Europe in the wake of World War I, the idea that these would act as a buffer between the German Empire and the Russian Empire, which soon after became the Soviet Union. Now, according to Flint, what are boundaries about? They're there to control flows and movements. So there are connections between boundaries and security. So the idea that they will try and ensure there's no unwanted movements of goods, of people into your country. And the idea of a boundary is linked to the concept of a state. So boundaries are part and parcel of the makeup of states, which is a political geographical entity that required territorial specificity as the basis of its sovereignty. So the idea behind the state is there must be a territory for the state, and there must be a defined territory. So boundaries for states, they delineate the population and resources that come under the control of particular states. So without boundaries, you don't have a state system, because otherwise there's chaos and confusion as to where one state begins and another state ends. And you'd be in a situation of permanent conflict. So distinct delineated boundaries are key elements of the world political system, and also, as I suggested before, the world economic system. Now we're going to move on to the main part of this particular lecture, focusing on the state. So the world political map breaks the planet up into a number of sovereign states, roughly 200 sovereign states around the world. Often a taken for granted feature, as I said. Sometimes when there's not much happening in terms of new states being created, not much happening in terms of state boundaries being changed, you can almost take kind of it for granted that this current shape of the world political system will always be there. But things change, history happens, and things can change. State formation is facilitated through the concept of a nation. So the idea that, I will talk more about the nation in the next lecture. One of the big ideas, more or less since the 1900s, since the rise of nationalism in the 1900s, one of the big ideas is that a state should be representative of a particular group of people, a nation. And it's linked to nationalism and the territorial ideology that links people to specific places. So one of the big ideas, particularly in the nationalist worldview, one of the big ideas is that states should represent particular nations. Each nation should have its own state, which can be problematic because sometimes the territory that nations believe belongs to them can be part of a bigger state or part of another state. So now I will mention this again and again, and you'll be sick of me. I want you in this module not to use the term nation to refer to states. Nations and states. Now, you will hear the term nation used in the media sometimes to refer to states, but that's wrong. Sometimes other bloody academics will use the term nation to refer to states. That's wrong. Nations are groups of people. States refer to all the different legal, juridical elements that make up a sovereign state, including boundaries, state territory, and so on. So they're obviously linked, and they can be very closely linked, but nations and states are not exactly, they're not the same thing. So I'm now going to give you a number of different definitions of the state. So I'm going to start with what I'd like to call the simplistic definition, which says basically a state is an inhabited territory effectively controlled by an indigenous sovereign state. So this basically says a state must have 4 different elements. There must be a territory. If you don't have a territory, there's no state. You can't kind of just say, oh, I'm going to create a state in cyberspace or AI or whatever people are bloody well into today. You can't, if you have no territory, there's no state. Now, the territory, the size of the state territory, the Vatican state is the smallest state in the world. So that doesn't have a lot of territory, but it still has a significant amount of territory. I remember back in the 70s, someone decided to create declare an oil rig or a tanker to be an independent state, and they called it Sealand, but no, that's not territory. So you need territory. You also need population. So why is Antarctica not a state? There's no population there. You need a population. You need indigenous control, so the territory must be controlled by a government that's of that territory. If another country controls the territory, then it's not a state, it's a colony. And last of all, sovereignty. There must be, as discussed already, one absolute final authority. The government and the state must have full control over the state territory. Now, moving on to the more complex definitions. This is Weber's definition. Now, I'm going to give you definitions from Weber and Bourdieu of the state, which captures some key elements of what makes up a state. So Weber's definition, it says it's an X, it's a thing. And he just calls it an X because there's so many different elements that make up the state. But what's the key element for Bourdieu? It's an X. It must successfully claim the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical and symbolic violence over a definite territory and over the totality of the corresponding population. So effectively, for a state to exist, the government must have the monopoly over the legitimate use of physical and symbolic violence. So there must be just one state army, there must be just one state police. The state must effectively control all the territory in military terms. If it's a case that the state doesn't manage to do that, and you'll see this in parts of the world today, if there's a conflict, civil war within the state, and other groups control parts of the state, then it's basically the state effectively, if you use Weber's definition, the state effectively ceases to exist as a state. It's no longer, because the government or the state no longer has this monopoly over the legitimate use of physical and symbolic violence. And we're going to see elements of that in next week's lecture when I talk about fragile states. So states that are, in legal terms, members of the United Nations, in legal terms, recognized as independent states, but the government of the state doesn't effectively control all of the state territory. Bourdieu's definition. Bourdieu says the state is the culmination of a process, and this is interesting, it's a process. So Bourdieu's getting across the idea that states just don't happen overnight, they emerge over time. So a state is the culmination of a process of concentration of different types of capital. Now, capital here, I'll just explain, when Bourdieu's talking about capital, he's not talking about just economic capital, which is obviously a factor there listed there. He's talking about capital as things that engender or give power. So he talks about the capital of physical force. Again, instruments of coercion, your army, your police force. So he talks about economic capital. He talks about informational and cultural capital. So informational capital, the creation of a state education system, for instance, symbolic capital, flags and anthem. So the idea is that over time, the state will start to get more and more control over these different elements. So you might have a period at the beginning of the state where the government of the state controls part of the state, but not all the state. But over time, as the state gets stronger, it starts to monopolize its military control over the state territory. The state starts to monopolize its influence over the economic system. The state starts to, as it becomes more mature, it starts to create, it creates its own education system. And an education system is important for the state as it's part of the process of engendering state legitimacy, getting in the minds of people that they see the state as the legitimate political representative of themselves. They feel part of the state. They feel the state represents them. And of course, symbolic capital, language, anthems, state flags, and so on. So capital, as I said, it's not just economic capital in the mindset of Bourdieu. He's a French philosopher. That's all you need to know. Capital is about power. Power allows you to do things. He also talks about status capital, which reflects this process would reflect the building up of a state bureaucratic system. Ultimately, Bourdieu's big idea is that the state emerges over time. The state emerges from a relationship, dialectic, and sometimes a problematic relationship with different localities or peripheral areas as part of the state. So Bourdieu's idea is as the state spreads, as the state increases its power, as it increases its monopoly over all these different elements of the state, this can be met by a counter response or resistance from groups in the peripheral, in the peripheries. So if you look at, say, the United Kingdom, as a state, initially emerged as England, parts of England, went on in the 1200s. You took in Wales, but there was resistance from Wales. Eventually also took in Scotland, took in Ireland, there was resistance from Ireland. So the idea that the spread of the state isn't necessarily always welcomed by everyone who's part of that state. It's often resisted by, definitely and particularly resisted from groups on the periphery of the state who don't really identify with the state to the same extent as people, say, in the center of the state. So Bourdieu's ideas can be captured in this, if you look at the historical development of the state. And when we're talking about the historical development of the state, we're looking particularly at the development of the state in the Western world, and particularly Europe. So again, getting across the idea that the world political map is a snapshot at a time. Now, the modern state system doesn't really start to take shape until after 1500. Roughly around, it starts to take shape around the time of the Renaissance and the Reformation. In the medieval period, you did have monarchies, but the monarchies didn't really have the same level of control that they would have in monarchies didn't have the same level of control in the 1300s that they would enjoy in the 1600s. So monarchies were limited in terms of what they could control. They had an army, but they weren't the only. The king wasn't the only person in the state or in the territory with an army. Lords, barons had their own army. In most cases, they put their armies at the service of the monarch when it was needed. But at other times, if there was a row, they might just kind of say, you know what, I don't want anything more to do with this king. I just look after my own area. I just keep to myself. So sovereignty was shared, nested hierarchies. The king had a certain level of power, but a number of different lords or barons or knights underneath the king all had a certain level of power as well. So lords lorded over barons, barons over knights, and so on. So there was a hierarchy, but everyone at this hierarchy had a certain level of power and control. The monarch, the king or queen, didn't fully control everything. They didn't have the capacity to fully control the state. And sovereignty was also shared between secular powers and religious powers. So the church also had a lot of power as well. The church controlled a lot of lands within countries like England. The church controlled a particular amount of territory. In places like Italy, the church controlled effectively its own. The church had its own effective state, much larger than the Vatican state today. Territories were also spatially separated. So a lot of territories controlled by monarchs were spatially separated. What I mean by that is that a king might control territory in France, but they might also control territory in Spain, they might control territory in Austria. So territories were also spatially separated. So there's a lot of messiness involved in the world political map in medieval times. All this changes in the 1500s with the National Revolution. So you might remember when I was talking about electoral geography, I talked about the impacts of the National Revolution and Industrial Revolution. I covered that very quickly, so you might have forgot about this. But the National Revolution refers to the emergence of the modern state from the 1500s onwards, which effectively saw the removal or displacement of the nested hierarchies. So with the Reformation, the power of the church in a number of states was undermined. In states that went from Catholicism to Protestantism, the territory controlled by the church was effectively just taken away by the monarchs. The nested hierarchies were also removed or displaced. So no longer did you have lords having a certain level of control in their part of the territory. No longer had you barons or knights. You started to see the monarch gaining absolute control over the state territory over time. And how was this achieved? Well, in medieval times, a lord could control his own territory mainly by dint of having his own castle. So a lord had his own castle, and he knew if he controlled his castle, could get behind his castle, he had a certain degree of power and protection there. So if the lord fell out with the monarch could come with his army and say, you in that castle, come out here now and I'll behead you. And the lord would say, actually, no, thanks. I think I'm going to stay here for a long time. I've loads of supplies here. So you know what? If you want to lay siege to this castle, that's fair enough. I've enough here to keep me going for the next year. And there would be a bit of a siege, and eventually the monarch would go, you know what, I've better things to do, and sod off home. And the lord would wave away at the windows of the castle saying, nuts to you, mate, bye. However, things changed with the invention of gunpowder. So now local lords, local barons no longer could rely on their castle walls for security, because if they fell out with the monarch could just rock up with a few cannons, knock down the walls, and bye-bye lord. So with the invention of gunpowder, the security that you used to have in castle walls was no longer there. And ultimately, in the period after Reformation, there was a growing recognition that size matters. there was a growing recognition that power and protection was only going to be guaranteed to you by the monarch. You couldn't rely on your local lord anymore for protection, because if another army arrived with cannons, with gunpowder, you had no chance. So ultimately, in the modern periods of the modern state system, ultimately size matters. The only guarantee of protection that you had was the king or queen, was the monarch and a big state army. You also start to see a territorialization of power of politics as well. So you start to see a move away from monarchs controlling different territories across different parts of Europe, and you start to see the state territory becoming more compact, more defined. Power becomes more centralized within the state territory. The monarch starts to increase his or her power over the state territory. Ultimately, the growth of the territorial state was seen as the main solution to the problem of a growing lack of security that came after the invention of gunpowder. So as I said, like with gunpowder, you no longer could rely on castle walls for security, so you realized the only source of security you could have was a large state army that could and would protect the state territory. Now, to have a big state army, you need to pay for the big state army. And to pay for the big state army, taxes needed to be raised. So there was the creation of, or recreation of, a state taxation system. There were taxes before, but a more formal taxation system was put in place. If you need a taxation system, you need civil servants. So you also start to see the creation of a state bureaucracy. State sovereignty was initially placed largely in the hands of absolute monarchs. When I say absolute monarchs, I'm talking here of kings and queens who had absolute power within the state territory. When you move into the 1800s and 1900s, this notion, at least in Europe, this notion of having absolute monarchs starts to die out. So over time, the powers placed in the hands of kings and queens, the powers start to reduce quite significantly, particularly from the 1800s onwards. And you start to see more and more power being placed into the hands of state parliaments. So in the 1600s, 1700s, the state would have basically been viewed as, the embodiment of the state would have been the king or queen. When you move into the 1800s, you need a new source of identity or definition for the state. And from the 1800s, with the rise of nationalism as a philosophy, the state starts to be seen as the effective political representation of a particular nation. So the idea that the state represents a nation or a group of nations. As you move into the 1600s, 1700s, you start to see the state becoming more and more powerful in different aspects of everyday life. With the rise of mercantilism, the Dutch state becomes the first state to actually pursue a process of economic development. And you very quickly start to see the emergence of a capitalist state. And this happens with the agricultural and industrial revolutions. The agricultural revolution obviously is important because this led to more intensive forms of agriculture. It led to higher agricultural yields. And the agricultural revolution effectively allowed for large urban populations, because you now had a surplus food being produced in rural areas, which could then be sold on to the cities, and allowed for the growth of cities, and ultimately allowed for the Industrial Revolution. So with the capitalist state, you see different phases in it. In the 1800s, for instance, you had the states were pursuing processes of capitalism, but in the 1800s, states weren't particularly interested in the everyday lives of the state's citizens. You had what was called laissez-faire states, where the state more or less said, okay, we're going to largely stay out of the everyday lives of our citizens. and we won't intervene. And this process of non-interventionism, of laissez-faire capitalism, was particularly evident, say, in the United Kingdom in the 1840s, when the British government largely didn't really intervene to try and resolve the Great Famine in Ireland. So this idea of laissez-faire capitalism, you're a night watchman, the state's there, but it's not really doing much. It's kind of just protecting the state boundaries. But in terms of its impact on the everyday lives of citizens, not much was happening. When you move into the 1900s, the state starts to become more hands-on, more interventionist in terms of the well-being of its citizens. And there's a reason for that. If you look at the notion of capitalism, the reason for that, a recognition that the state needed to be producing a healthy and educated workforce. So the state starts to become more interventionist. You start to see the creation of a state education system, probably from the late 1800s onwards. In the wake of World War II, the state becomes even more interventionist. So you have a move to what some might call a nanny state, where the state, you have a state welfare system, you have a state education system, a state health system, and so on. All this ties up with a process or a period of nation building where you start to see the promotion of a common state language. So in Europe, most big European states in the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s, you had a main or major state language, so French obviously in France, English, but there were a number of other languages that were widely spoken in different parts of the state. As you move into the late 1800s and 1900s, all these minority languages start to decline because people start to realize that they need to be speaking the state language in order to be able to do business, to be able to do things. So you start to see languages like Cornish, like Breton, like Irish go into decline in the late 1800s and 1900s. This is also related to the process of a spread of mass education, the emergence of a state education system, which obviously also helped in the process of promoting a common state language. So the capitalist state and geographers such as David Harvey basically see the state system as a necessary element for capitalism. As I said before, the idea that you need the stability provided by states who have defined boundaries, defined territories. You need that stability to allow the capitalist system to progress and to thrive. Now, some see the state as being important in terms of promoting and legitimizing the creation of wealth. Now, we talked about this in the previous section, the idea that, okay, why should the state be so pro-economic development? For liberal democracies, the government of a state will basically say, well, a strong economy means a happy workforce, a happy electorate, and a happy electorate means we have a better chance of staying in power. So what can the state do for, in terms of the creation of wealth, in terms of not just, it can secure social consensus, so using the education system to basically get across to kind of promote the idea that economic development is a good thing. It assists the reproduction of labor, education system, health system, welfare system, which allows for the creation of and the maintenance of the workforce. It sustains private production and capital accumulation, so it can offer grants or supports to private businesses. Certain things that the state does, like build roads, build railways, also helps in the process, also helps for private businesses to thrive. Last of all, it acts to resolve rationality and legitimation crises. Now, I won't go into these. Basically, the state will act if the economy hits a period of recession. And sometimes the state will act differently to resolve different recessions. So when we talk about these crises, we're usually referring to a period of economic recession. Now, the state involvement in resolving these recessions is important, because the one thing you get with capitalism is you get periods of boom and bust. The general consensus is that periods of boom are often associated with a new innovation. So if you look, say, at the periods between the late early 1800s and the early 1900s, you had the invention of steam power in the late 1700s, which led to a period of economic growth. And then there was a period of bust, a new innovation, the railroads came in, and that led to a period of economic growth, and then another period of bust. And then in the early 1900s, electrification and the invention of the car led to another period of economic growth, which in turn was followed by a period of economic decline or a recession. So particularly the recession there in the 1930s associated with the Great Depression. So with these Kondratiev cycles, you can see there's periods of boom and bust, periods of Kondratiev upturns, but also Kondratiev downturns, which are recessions or crises of accumulation. Sometimes too much investment in the economy leading to hyperinflation, sometimes not enough investment in the state economy. There's two major cycles in the 20th century. The first of which, the first downturn was associated with the Great Depression in the late 1920s and the 1930s. The second downturn was associated with the global oil crisis. The kind of what happened in the wake of the global oil crisis in the mid-1970s. Now, the state responded to both of these crises, but it responded differently. The response to the Great Depression, the economic crisis in the wake of the Great Depression, you had the setting up of a welfare state and a corporate state. So the state became very hands-on. The welfare state, you had greater state investment in education, greater state investment in health, greater state investment in basically people's welfare. Corporate state, the nationalization of key industries. The state became more active as the state almost became an industry in itself. You had the nationalization of key infrastructure such as railways, key infrastructure such as energy, power plants, and so on. So the state became very hands-on. You had the nationalization of key industries. The response to the economic recession of the 1970s and 1980s, which also tied in with a shift in the global production process. So a move to a different style of production. So you had different things happening. You had the oil crisis, but you also had this shift away from the old style of production, the Ford style production, where most production processes took place in a big factory in the developed world, and that resulted in large amounts of employment being created for people in and around certain industrial cities, particularly in the north of England, the south of Wales and south central Scotland. In the 1970s and 80s, the shift in the global production process was a process of global economic restriction, a move to flexible accumulation and disorganized capitalism. What I mean by that is these big industrial plants that were in existence were broken up. The production processes, because of developments in technology, in transport, production processes were broken up, and instead of everything now happening in one big industry, parts of the production process, usually the most labor-intensive parts of the production process, were moved to places where labor costs were much cheaper, particularly the global south or the developing world, which led to a massive increase in unemployment levels in parts of the developed world, particularly the old industrial cities. Now, the response of the state to this crisis was very different to the response of the state to the economic crisis in the 1930s. In the 1980s, and this was a period dominated by people like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and Helmut Kohl, the state instead decided, no, the best way to respond is to reduce state investment. We need to the state basically said, oh, maybe the problem is there's too much state intervention, and maybe that's part of the problem here. So you start to see the state reduce the size of the welfare state, and also you saw the breaking up of the old corporate state. So instead of nationalizing industries, as had been the case in the 1930s and 40s, you now start to see a process of privatization of what used to be state-controlled industries. So you moved from nationalization to privatization. So there has been some questions recently as to whether the state is in decline. Some people have said, well, who controls the world today? Some say it's in a globalized world. Does the state really have much economic powers? A lot of people have pointed to the economic powers that have been leached away from states to global markets. Others talk about states as being unable to deal with issues that are transnational. So again, cast your mind back to the last lecture and think about what we said about transnational pollution as a transnational issue, acid rain, global warming, etc. There's also been a growing recognition of the weakening of the state's military role. So especially in the wake of World War II, a growing recognition that most states rely on bigger, powerful states to protect them. So NATO, for instance, a recognition that the USA is important in terms of a recognition that the USA was important in terms of guaranteeing the security of states in Western Europe, and so on. Others have pointed to a move away from territorially based sovereignty to a postmodern or new medieval form of inclusive territoriality. So the idea that no longer is the state controlling everything, you're now seeing power being shared out once again between different levels. So if you look at a state look at Europe, certain levels of power are held by the European Union, so you have a transnational level of power. Certain levels of power are still held by the state, but now certain levels of power have been devolved down to local governments or regional governments. So the idea that sovereignty is being shared by different institutions and at different levels. However, the state is still important, and you can see the importance of the state in more recent times in terms of how it's responded to big issues or big problems. So the global recession in the late 2000s, 2007, 2008, one of the knock-on effects of that was you start to see a growing recognition of the importance of the state once again, and a growing recognition of the importance of the state in trying to resolve this economic crisis for the benefit of the state citizens. And again, with COVID, 2020, 21, 22, with COVID, again, you once again saw the importance of the state. So there is a growing recognition that at times of crisis, the state still is a very important body in terms of ensuring things get done and in terms of ensuring that the state citizens are protected. So is the state in decline? Probably not, although certain powers have been lost, powers that the state had maybe in the 1930s, 40s. The state no longer has those powers because of globalization or because of the changing sands of global politics. But the state is still important in terms of particularly, and the importance of the state particularly comes to, becomes evident at times of crisis, such as the COVID crisis in 2020, 21, 22.